gruesome crime scene leaves witnesses shocked.
That officer noticed a foot protruding, and then she realized that there was a body in there.
He fell on the ground. It was just horrible. And I start crying thinking about it.
When best friends become secret lovers, families become enemies. A killer hides in plain sight.
We think we know people sometimes, but we don't always.
I could see her knees buckle.
And I said to myself, oh my God.
And that's when she realized that she needed to come clean and tell the truth.
Take a dark journey through a maze of sex, sports cars, secrets, and money.
Did she ever confront you about this? No. She never said anything to you? No.
And I said, will we find your DNA in there? And she said, yes.
To expose a jaw-dropping tale of adultery, fraud, and cold-blooded murder.
This is one of the biggest cases I've worked on.
People that have felt safe in that part of town instantly thought, well, could that happen to me?
Something wrong was going on.
Lies upon top of lies.
I think it's kind of sick.
A small secret can become a big secret and can lead to some very bad things.
A secret to die for.
Countrywood is a neighborhood outside the busy part of Memphis.
And it is adjacent to the country club there, the golf course.
It is big homes, pools.
Not a lot of crime there.
Police would tell me it was like Mayberry there compared to the rest of the city.
Countrywood residents Tina and Joe Corona are a big part of this upscale suburban community. And after 15 years of marriage, their life seems ideal.
They were madly in love. I mean, they just couldn't keep their hands off of each other.
If somebody was looking at Tina and Joe from afar, their relationship looked perfect. They had everything that they wanted. They were happy.
Tina is a vivacious and popular member of the community. She's also a successful VP at a top financial firm.
I tell people all the time, she had it. She has whatever it is that people want to be around. She has it.
Tina was involved in the financial world, and she was making a really nice career for herself.
Even though she had not had graduated college with a formal business degree, Tina had a natural ability. My father was in business, my mother was in accounting, and that's all my sister knew growing up.
Tina is not the only one who appreciates her parents' business success. Thanks to her father's mentoring, Tina's husband Joe has gone from selling shoes to running a successful investment firm, Corona Investments.
Tina's father, who had a successful insurance company and sold annuities and things like that, brought Joe in to teach him the business.
So what Joe was doing is he was selling annuities, and these are ways to invest your money, get a good result. They're seen as very safe. It's not like you're playing the stock market or, being risky with your money.
Once Joe was selling insurance and they had a better income, Joe became very confident in himself. And the more things that they were able to buy.
Tina had nice clothes, she had nice jewelry. The Corvettes obviously caught a lot of people's eyes.
The more successful they became, the more vehicles that they did acquire.
The Coronas are a power couple who have a taste for the finer things in life. They share a passion for collecting sports cars and love to race over to their friends at the Memphis Corvette Club.
The Corvette Club was their life, was their personality.
It was a big deal to my sister.
Tina and Joe loved the Memphis social scene. They're often out on the town with another couple, Becky and Bruce Black.
Tina and Joe's friends, Becky and Bruce, they did a lot with them.
They hung out all the time. The wives got along well, the husbands got along well. They were just seen as the best of friends.
Becky and Bruce are more than just Tina and Joe's friends. They're also in business together.
Becky and Bruce did invest with Joe in the Corona Investments.
And they aren't the only investors from Joe's social group.
Generally, his clients came from people they knew together.
That's why he wanted to come to our church, because that would be an opportunity that he could get a lot of people's business.
All the investments people were making were for their retirement.
We heard from different people. You know, we invested our money with Joe. He learned from Mr. Murphy. Everything's good.
Investing with Joe Corona feels like a safe bet. But behind the scenes at Corona Investments, Joe was taking advantage of his clients' good faith. His clientele are mostly friends who don't ask a lot of questions.
People were willing to write over these checks and give money, and they didn't even always ask for paperwork on it. They just trusted him.
It never crossed our minds that Joe would be doing something bad.
Making matters worse, Joe struggles to conceal a nasty and growing habit.
Oh my gosh, he gambled.
Joe spent a lot of time at the casinos. He was down there several times a week. Tina used to go down there with him all the time, but over time it became more of a secret that he was going down there.
I do know one Thursday afternoon, he took a trip down to the casinos and he spent a little over $40,000.
Joe absolutely had a gambling problem.
Joe losing thousands of dollars of their hard-earned money isn't the only thing going on behind Tina's back. Tina's lifelong friend has other misgivings.
I believe there were numerous women.
I had people come up to me and say, "Is Tina and Joe still married?" And I'd say, "Yeah, why?"
When whispers of Joe's indiscretions reach the family, they choose to keep their suspicions to themselves in order to protect Tina.
There were never conversations with Tina about Joe. Anything that you said to Tina about Joe, she was going to tell Joe. And that was not something you wanted to happen.
It put us in a very awkward situation. So I let that one slide.
But it's about to become impossible for Tina's family to keep a lid on Joe's secrets.
I'll never forget that day. It was probably about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I had gone by the movie theater to see what was showing, and there they were.
Joe is out in public with another woman.
I caught them together.
Joe's secret is just the tip of the iceberg.
Small secrets can sometimes become bigger secrets, and in this case, it became a deadly secret.
Rumours about Joe Corona's womanizing are confirmed by his mother-in-law. And the woman he is seen with is a shocker.
Joe and Becky Black. And when I saw them, it just scared me to death. And they acted like they didn't see me.
Joe works quickly to cover his tracks.
Tina called me that night and she said, "Mom, Joe said that you saw him at the movie theater." And I said, "I did. He was there with Becky." She said, "Yeah, he said that they were meeting Bruce there to go over some insurance." I felt terrible for Tina that he was doing this and lying to her about it.
But Tina believes Joe's excuses. And the Coronas continue to socialise with Becky and her husband. One night, Tina and Joe are out with Bruce and Becky for one of their high-rolling blowouts at the casino. Bruce thinks nothing of dropping a few $1,000s at the blackjack table.
Bruce was a breadwinner in his family. He was very successful, made a lot of money.
Bruce was a fun-loving guy, but he did like to gamble. He liked to drink.
Joe would say, I love going to the casinos with Bruce because he had the money.
Late into the night, the drinks are flowing freely and Bruce's bets keep getting bigger. Coincidentally, Tina's brother, Scott, and his wife, Sheila, are there that night too.
Joe was not playing, Bruce was playing.
Bruce was very intoxicated and he had stacks of chips.
I guess around $50,000 of chips on the table there.
When Scott and Sheila joined the group, they noticed something unusual.
Joe did not drink, and normally people that don't drink don't really enjoy being around drunk people. But he did. He could take advantage of friends.
And Joe certainly appears to be taking advantage of Bruce.
Joe was helping him out by counting his chips and taking them, getting them cashed in every so often so nothing happened to his money. Joe said he was doing him a favor.
And we just laughed, thinking, oh, he's going to take care of it for him. He's going to take it.
I think probably Joe was doing a 2-for-1 special.
It looks like Joe was pocketing some of Bruce's winnings.
The chances are high that Joe was skimming some of that money off the top if Bruce was getting any of it back. When we left the casino that night, I just thought, that was the craziest thing I'd ever seen.
Little does Scott know Joe's reckless behaviour is just getting started. Scott and Joe have office space in the same building, and he's about to get a front row seat to something unfathomable.
Scott came home from work one day and was pretty upset, and I'm asking him what's wrong. And he told me that he had seen Joe and Becky having sex in Joe's office.
The truth is, Joe and Becky have been having an affair for almost a decade. As time passes, they seem less concerned about getting caught.
Joe and Becky were not trying to be discreet at all. They ran around as if they were married.
And back at home, Joe was spending an unusual amount of time on his phone every day.
I believe my sister started having an idea that Joe was up to something.
And Tina asked Joe for the phone bill, and he did not want to give it to her. He did end up giving her a version of the phone bill, but Tina had also contacted the carrier and got the real bill. And when she looked at what Joe gave her compared to what the carrier sent, it was not the same thing. He had done a cut and paste job on the phone bill, and with the real bill, she could see how many times he talked to Becky.
They were talking 16 times a day.
Faced with indisputable evidence, Joe makes a stunning admission about his relationship with Becky.
When Tina confronted Joe, he said, well, yes, but it was more of an emotional relationship. She doesn't mean anything to me. You mean everything to me. You're the love of my life.
Once again, with unwavering belief in Joe and their relationship, Tina falls for his lies.
And Joe told Tina that the affair was over.
Joe promises Tina that he'll work to rebuild their marriage. But then she receives another crushing blow.
My husband died in his sleep, and I was just in a daze.
Family was very important to Tina, and that really rocked her world.
Tina was a daddy's girl. She loved her daddy very much. She was devastated.
As grief and turmoil engulf Clara, Tina and Scott, dangerous deceit, secrets and lies threaten to further rip this family apart. In the days following James Murphy's death, the distraught family bonds together and moves forward as best they can.
It was devastating to the whole family. Clara was more than devastated, and Tina too. All she kept saying was, what am I going to do without my daddy?
In the midst of their grief, Tina's husband Joe steps up.
When my father passed away, Joe jumped right in and said, "Hey, look, I'm gonna help you guys, help your mom."
Joe started telling me how much he loved me, which shocked me. He'd never told me that in his life.
Joe offers to help with the more complex part of the estate, James Murphy's vast car collection.
Tina's father had collected cars.
He had Bentleys, Rolls Royces, 57 Chevrolets, old Corvettes, but he would buy and sell them.
And Joe had said, hey, I'll sell these vehicles, you know, we'll get the money from them, that'll help with things.
I had no reason to doubt that he wouldn't help my mother and do the right thing.
As Joe makes deals to sell the antique cars, Tina has time to reflect and decide she and Joe could use a fresh start in a new home.
Tina had a nice house, but Tina wanted the next house. She said, we deserve almost a show palace of a house. And she figured, we have the money, let's move. Let's do it now. Why should we wait any longer in life?
Joe agrees, but secretly knows there's no way he can come up with the down payment. He controls the household finances.
She'd have to ask him if she could have some money to go shopping.
He controlled every single thing that she did. He decided where they were going to go for dinner. He decided what movie they were going to see, what event they were going to go to.
She couldn't go to a doctor's appointment without him. She couldn't go to a nail appointment without him.
He was the most controlling person I've ever met in my life.
Some people will tell you that Tina wanted someone who was stronger than her in the relationship. Someone to kind of take care of her, to celebrate her and support her, and that's what Joe's personality really lent itself to, at least on the outside. But the question was, what was really happening behind the scenes?
The hard truth is, they are drowning in debt. Joe's gambling away their money, and despite promises to the contrary, his secret relationship with Becky is stronger and more intense than ever.
One minute, she's smiling to Tina. The next minute, she's having an affair with her husband.
It would have been real convenient for Tina to be out of the way for Becky.
Becky wanted Joe. She wanted a life with Joe, and Joe wanted a life with Becky. But I don't know that either one were willing to leave their spouses because it was really convenient. Both their spouses are earning a living for the two of them to play around every day.
When Joe wraps the sale of his father-in-law's vehicles, Clara is eager to find out how much money he's made. But strangely, her bank statements are no longer being delivered in the mail.
All of a sudden, they weren't coming to the house anymore.
And the family thought it was very strange.
Like, this is weird.
When my mother-in-law talked to a neighbor, they indicated they had seen Joe pulling up in the driveway and pulling mail out of the mailbox.
He was checking mail and then putting mail back in there, so he was looking for specific pieces of mail.
Scott and Sheila are convinced Joe's been stealing Clara's bank statements. But that's not even the half of it.
I realized that something wrong was going on. Sheila helped me, and we logged everything that Joe had done.
And went through each car and how much Joe had told her that it was sold for versus how much was actually deposited in the bank.
One of the vehicles was a Bentley. They had 23,000 miles on it, and Joe had ended up selling that car for around $20-something thousand. And I had pulled up paperwork where my father had turned down several $50,000 offers on the vehicle.
Joe had stolen about $30,000. It was Tina's mother.
Turns out Joe has been selling the cars under value to make fast cash for himself.
I couldn't believe it. He's a piece of work.
To do somebody that way when they were grieving made me angry.
Tina's family has had enough. Joe is about to face the music.
Clara called Tina and Joe and said she wanted to have a family meeting about all this money.
I think it was an aha moment for Clara and Scott. They were right about Joe all along.
So when Joe and Tina got there, we said we need to go over everything on the vehicles.
All of the paperwork was presented to Tina and Joe. Joe immediately got nervous. He was sweating profusely.
As accusations fly, Joe angrily denies everything.
That was a very ugly moment in time.
In Joe's mind, he didn't owe my mother any money for the cars that he had sold.
Tina once again defends her husband.
How dare they accuse my husband of stealing money? How can my family treat me this way?
I couldn't understand how Tina could believe everything that Joe was telling her. You've already found him to be a cheater, and now he's a thief. At what point is she going to wake up?
As the family conflict reaches a boiling point, Tina is faced with a heartbreaking decision.
And Joel turns to her and says, "It's me or it's them." And Tina chooses Joe.
Tina got up and said she'd lost her family. I just started bawling, and they left.
Despite clear evidence that Joe is stealing, Tina stands by her husband.
The fact that Tina chose Joe over him and his mom, it was very painful.
It was really hard on me, and I know it was hard on my mother.
Tina's loyalty to Joe comes at a huge cost. This family will never be the same. In the weeks following the Murphy family clash, Tina abandons her family and her world is getting smaller.
She felt like everyone was against her.
And life is no picnic for Joe. His clients are mostly friends who are starting to demand answers about the money they put in his company, Corona Investments.
Joe counted on people not asking questions and really saying, well, it's my friend. He would never do me wrong. I'm sure he's watching out for the best interest of myself, my family, my children's college funds. But what they didn't know was behind the scenes, Joe was not investing their money. Joe was taking their money.
And it's becoming more difficult for Joe to conceal the truth.
People would ask for paperwork. Why haven't I gotten it yet? What was happening with their money? And they felt that Joe was giving them a runaround. Joe didn't like questions. Joe would push you away. And that raised a red flag with people. And it started eventually creating tension.
He was constantly chasing his tail. He just ran in circles, and he was losing control.
Tina is oblivious to Joe's shady business dealings. She's at the top of her career, believes that they're in great financial shape, and wants to move to a posh Memphis neighborhood.
Tina didn't really ask questions about the money.
Tina believed that the house that they currently lived in was paid for. But it had a sizable mortgage on it.
She thinks they're free and clear. And she assumed that they had a lot of money in the bank.
Even with cash buyers for their current house, Joe keeps stalling on the purchase of the new home.
Joe says we gotta show this, then he's gotta find something else for the mortgage people. I don't know when we're gonna close on this house.
Joe knew that when you start getting banks involved and you start having people look into finances to buy that beautiful house that Tina wants, you can't hide things. People are gonna find out.
The walls were closing in on him, and eventually something had to give.
Joe's lies and betrayals are starting to catch up with him, and he knows it. The last thing he wants is for Tina to uncover the truth.
There's an indication that Tina was perhaps starting to ask questions.
This house that they were supposed to be buying just kept dragging on, and I think she knew that there was more to all of this and something wasn't right. I think she was on the verge of discovering the truth.
Tina's worries and suspicions are affecting her health, and she reaches a dangerous low point.
I could tell she wasn't herself. She wasn't the bright light in the room. She was very dim.
It's almost like the persona started cracking. You know, not feeling well, putting weight on.
She said, I just feel fat and ugly. And I said, is Joe doing this to you? She goes, well, I guess when he tells me that he's not physically attracted to me.
And there's more on Tina's mind. Becky Black is still on the scene, and her behaviour is starting to creep Tina out.
Becky wearing the same kind of clothes that Tina wore, wearing the same perfume. It was Joe's favorite perfume.
Her hair, she bleached her hair like Tina.
I think it's kind of sick. I'd never seen her so depressed.
As her melancholy intensifies, Tina searches for something to celebrate. An upcoming dinner party at the Memphis Corvette Club may be just what she needs.
She was president-elect of the club. The club had a lot of activities going on.
And she was tasked with getting things ready for this party.
So Joe said that he had told Tina to take the truck because she was getting party supplies.
While Tina runs errands, Joe has plans to work on one of his classic cars.
He had a souped-up vehicle, and one of his friends from the Corvette Club was going to help him work on it.
By early evening, Tina hasn't arrived at the Corvette Club.
People are calling Joe from the Corvette Club, and they're like, hey, we're trying to get in touch with Tina. We haven't heard from her.
Joe says he doesn't know where she is, but he's worried. She's been gone all day, and he hasn't heard from her.
Joe called me Saturday night and wanted to know if I had seen or heard from Tina. So I checked, and I said, I have no missed calls, no texts, no message, no nothing. I said, what's going on? And he goes, well, she left here this morning, and she's not answering my calls.
Really worried.
No one has seen or heard from Tina, and now Joe and her friends are starting to worry.
I thought, oh gosh, what has she done? Did she take off? Did the depression get the best of her? What did that little sneaky girl do?
By 6 p.m, Tina Corona is a no-show at the Memphis Corvette Club. Panic is setting in. Her best friend Carrie is determined to find her.
I said, have you called the police? No. Have you called any hospitals? No. I said, I tell you what, you put a search party together and retrack where she was going that day.
So they were supposed to have a big party that night, and instead that party turned into a search party. And they spread out looking for Tina.
When Joe contacts the police, they agree to put out an APB and be on the lookout for the vehicle.
You have all of these people in the Corvette Club looking for Tina, and there are questions of why wouldn't you call the missing person's relatives?
She had apparently been missing since Saturday. Nobody had called me until Sunday afternoon. I spent the majority of Sunday night into Monday morning driving all around Memphis and different areas.
We drove around to the hospital. We were out till after 2 o'clock in the morning looking for her.
It was like looking for a needle in the haystack.
And I kept thinking maybe she got smart and left him.
The weekend search is fruitless. Until the next day. A resident in the nearby town of Bartlett calls police to report a suspicious vehicle has been parked in a dead-end street since Saturday.
The call came in to our dispatch, and they sent patrol units there. And once they got there, they ran the tag of the vehicle, and it came back as the one belonging to the missing individual, Miss Tina Corona. As they started looking at the vehicle, one of the officers looked through the back window and noticed that there was like a lump or something in the back covered with towels. And then as she looked further, that officer noticed a foot protruding in the lower portion of the leg from underneath the towels. And then she realized that there was a body in there.
Police quickly identify the body as Tina Corona.
The truck itself, it looked like it had been ransacked. The glove boxes were open, there was stuff thrown on the floorboards.
Police consider the possibility that Tina is the victim of a carjacking.
I got there and I observed that her shoes were just stacked together side by side. And I thought that odd.
Tina's purse and cell phone are gone, but her expensive jewelry is still there.
If you're gonna commit the dirty deed of a murder and carjack somebody's car or rob them, why would you not take $30,000 worth of rings? Because if it was a robbery, that's what you're gonna rob her for. Why would you leave it? So that seemed very odd to us. And it kind of struck a chord in the back of our head. There's something else going on here.
Officers are dispatched to deliver the tragic news to Tina's family.
My nerves were shot.
He fell on the ground, throwing up and crying, and it was just horrible. And now we're in protection mode for his mom.
Detectives are eager to speak with Joe about his wife.
What we started learning is that Joe was truly in love with Tina.
They question his whereabouts on the day Tina disappeared. Joe tells them he was at a friend's working on a classic car.
Joe says he drove back to the house and then kind of went on his day as normal.
Police confirm Joe's alibi. But Scott and Sheila have a lot to unload about Tina's disappearance, and they are quick to spill everything they know about Joe to the detectives.
We spent several hours with them and told them everything that I knew, unedited.
And then we start getting a different picture of Joe. Joe the manipulator. Joe the guy who's worried about money, who's trying to make the hustle. Tina's brother advised us that Joe had been carrying on an affair with Becky Black for many years. So here you are, you have the husband, he's having an affair with Becky Black, and who's to say that Becky Black didn't have something to do with the disappearance and the murder of Tina? So now she becomes a suspect also. At first, like anybody else who gets caught doing wrong, they don't want to tell you the truth. We told her, you know, we have the car, the Avalanche. We are going to search that Avalanche. We're going to find physical evidence. We're going to find DNA. And I said, okay, well, we find your DNA in there. And I could see her knees buckle. And that's when she realized that she needed to come clean and tell the truth. And she said, yes. And I said, how did your DNA get in there? Then she says, Joe and I had sex in the car. And we're like, okay, now we're getting somewhere.
Becky doesn't stop there. She reveals she's been secretly stashing tens of thousands of dollars in her attic.
So there were secrets happening everywhere. Becky's sleeping with Joe, and she's taking money from her husband and hiding it up in the attic to create an escape fund, as she saw it.
Becky's secrets make her a strong suspect. But police still don't have enough evidence to make an arrest. Meanwhile, the community remains unsettled and people want answers.
There was pressure on police to get this solved, to make an arrest, to make people feel comfortable, feel safe again in their city. And people just were wondering, why hasn't this been solved yet?
Then police receive a call from Tina's best friend, Carrie, who drops a bombshell.
I was literally consumed with her murder. But I was on my way to work one morning, and I was thinking about Joe and Tina, and I said to myself, oh my God, no.
A mountain of lies and deceit is about to come crashing down, and a murderous scheme is revealed. With her best friend's murder occupying her every thought, Carrie Brown's revelation is a game changer in the stalled investigation.
My husband and I discussed some debt we had. So we decided to make a withdrawal from our annuity to pay that debt off.
And she had asked Joe for that to happen. And Joe kept stonewalling her and wouldn't do it. And finally, it took her up to 3 weeks for it to happen.
And I thought to myself, that money that I got from Joe had Tina's name on it. Now, why would Tina's name be on my annuity? And I said to myself, oh my God.
Carrie calls her bank manager for clarification about the check and is stunned by what she learns.
She said, Carrie, it was a personal check from their checking account. This is fraud. You need to call the police. Like right now.
Carrie learns that Joe never purchased an annuity in her name. Instead, he pocketed the money she gave him.
Now we've got a husband who's cheating on his wife. Now he's cheating his wife's friends out of money. Maybe we need to look at Joe a lot more.
Armed with this new information, police subpoena Joe's bank records. They discover Joe is bilking his clients by depositing most of the money he receives into his own personal accounts. He then forges his clients' monthly investment statements.
Joe is a con artist. He's a scammer.
Joe Corona's shifty business dealings reveal the criminal side of his character and push him to the top of the suspect list in his wife's murder. And Becky Black is dismissed. As the months pass and the investigation rolls on, police acquire a key piece of evidence from a neighbour's home security camera.
We were able to recover the video from his system.
The footage shows the black pickup truck exit the garage on the morning of Tina's disappearance, but doesn't show the driver.
That's the truck that was found with Tina in the back of it dead. I think Joe's driving that truck.
The video also reveals Joe driving back to his garage later that day in one of his classic cars, a car that was not kept at his house.
A half a block from where she was found is a storage facility. And Joe keeps his antique cars at that storage facility.
Cell phone records confirm Joe was near his storage unit that day.
So he was within a 5-minute walking distance from the location that his wife was found to where his antique cars were.
This is the evidence they need.
We've got probable cause to put him in the scene, in the area, in the truck.
this point, investigators are thinking Joe killed his wife, abandoned her body in his truck, retrieved a car from his storage unit, and rushed to his friends to create an alibi. And when police follow up with the friend, he reveals their meetup was hastily arranged over the phone by Joe.
It was nothing that was set up. It was nothing that was agreed upon. He just called and said, "Hey, I'm on my way over there to work on that car with you."
Joe's fate is sealed. Police finally have enough evidence to piece together the murder. The motive boils down to Joe's financial fraud.
Did she ever confront you about this?
No.
She ever said anything to you?
No. If she'd have found that out, she'd have lit into me whatever she found it out.
I think she did let into you.
When did she do it?
Was it Saturday?
So we're thinking that something happened that morning when Tina was leaving. She found a piece of mail that said something about her finances were not what she thought, and that she confronted Joe about it. Joe's whole life is stealing from her friends. He couldn't let her get away knowing that he was stealing from everybody, and he snaps. We think she was held down and suffocated, which could happen by putting a plastic bag over the head or something of that nature. I believe she never left the house that day.
Joe then drove his wife's body to a dead-end street in the town of Bartlett and abandoned it, staging it to look like a botched robbery. It took 5 months to compile all the evidence that led to Joe Corona's arrest for murder. His conviction and life sentence in 2012 made headlines.
Prosecutors say her husband, Joe, smothered her with a plastic bag because she was about to find out he was a liar, philanderer, and thief.
We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder as charged in the indictment.
You know, she had all these people up here who loved her.
Joe never admitted to killing his wife. He did admit to the financial fraud part of it.
In 2013, Joe Corona was sentenced to 7 more years on fraud charges.
His take, more than $788,000.
Joe's deceit and manipulation led directly to Tina's estrangement from her family and her brutal murder. But shortly before her death, she quietly reached out to both her brother and her mother.
They both received an email from her in a way to mend things. And Scott had made her a wind chime for her birthday. And she said that she hoped that she could get the wind chime from him for her new house. And she went into telling him about a new house that she was planning on buying. He never got to give her the wind chime that he had made for her.
She was killed at 44 years old. She had her whole life was ahead of her. I just wished I'd gotten to see her in person before she died.
Tina being gone changed my mother-in-law. Tina being gone changed my husband. They'll never be the same people again. Family gatherings are not the same. That happiness is not there that we once had with her.
She knew I loved her.
Deep in the heart of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, a storm of startling secrets and terrible truths shock a close-knit community and fracture a family. With murder.
I still get emotional recounting this whole saga.
A lot of people were visibly upset and crying about what had happened.
There had been a lot going on behind the scenes for months that no one was really aware of.
The hidden secrets and deadly deceptions hide unthinkable crimes.
It was right under our noses and we didn't even know.
Lies untangled, tragically released.
It was shocking.
Nobody knew what had happened.
Who did it?
We don't know who this person is.
It's scary.
And why?
There was a lot of twists and turns to this case.
But nobody knows the real, twisted, sick, dark truth.
A secret to die for. In southern United States, on the banks of the Mississippi River, is the culturally rich city of Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Baton Rouge it's a great city. It's the capital of our state of Louisiana. There's lots of culture.
The reason people love it here is the food, the people.
It's a great place to live.
This exciting, eclectic locale attracts many people, including Scott Rogers.
Scott Rogers was a very flamboyant and charismatic person. Everybody loved his personality.
He was a charismatic type of person.
Scott was drawn to the rich culture of Baton Rouge for new and bigger opportunities, leaving his UK life behind.
In Bury St. Edmunds, England, Scott Rogers had started a performing arts academy with his former wife. He taught dance, they taught acting lessons, public speaking.
And I think at one point they had almost 800 children enrolled.
Scott loves his new home in the US, and it isn't long before his daughter, Kimmy, and two members of his extended family, Matthew and Stuart, join him in Baton Rouge.
From all appearances, Scott and the family seem to be doing very well. He bought a large house just south of Baton Rouge.
And it was a beautiful home.
And then after a period of time, Scott decided to adopt a little boy.
The adoption process is pretty straightforward. Fill out the paperwork and give a needy child a loving family.
And they were all living together in Scott Rogers' home.
And it was certainly large enough for all of the people that they had living under that roof. And Scott Rogers appeared to be the happiest person on earth.
But Scott and his family are harbouring shocking secrets and lies that are festering just below the surface.
It was right under our noses and we didn't even know the truth.
As Scott and his family embrace their new life in Baton Rouge, it isn't long before Scott begins making a name for himself around town.
Scott Rogers was very liked in the Baton Rouge area and the community. He was very involved in the church. He would help with charity events and anywhere and everywhere he could. People loved him.
To make money and help local charities, Scott starts a video production company, and everyone chips in.
It was a family-run business.
Matthew and Stuart, as well as Kimmy, were all involved in his production company.
Scott and his family produce promotional videos for several non-profits and charities in Baton Rouge. But the ambitious business owner has a secret desire.
He wanted to get in front of that camera.
After Scott was in Baton Rouge for a period of time, he started producing a television show.
He did a local TV show called Around Town on Saturday mornings.
The Around Town show continues now with all the good and positive in our community.
Scott had his family helping him. Stuart did pretty much most of the filming. Matthew ran the business.
And his daughter Kimmy works as Scott's assistant and receptionist.
He liked to bring people on to do a cooking segment. He had segments on there where people performed.
And over time, he built up an audience for the show itself, and he became more of a public figure within the community by jumping off of that show.
He was such an upbeat person, and people around Baton Rouge and surrounding areas, they loved him.
He was funny. In the day and age we live in, it's nice to just lay low and let the stress go and just laugh and smile. It just felt lighthearted that I wanted to keep watching.
Their studio was actually located in an old shopping mall here in the city. The cameras were top-notch, the latest technology. The lighting was professional. The sets were professional. Everything about it was first-rate.
That's when he really started getting a following.
And his show begins to attract more high-profile guests.
Scott was very, very good at bringing guests onto the show who had some sort of level of influence. Law enforcement executives from various agencies, public officials, congressmen, governor, the district attorney, and he would let them come onto his show and plug whatever they wanted to talk about.
Congressman, it's always a pleasure and an honor to have you on our show. Hey, Scott, it is great to be here.
So at this point, Scott has become somewhat of a known entity in the community. He's something of a celebrity. He's on television every week. He's showing up at different events.
Not sure if you caught the Dunham Jazz Ensemble around the corner as you came in. Amazing, talented group.
People did look at him as a local celebrity in Baton Rouge.
Scott finds a way to expand his audience even further and help his community.
He got invited to preach a sermon at a non-denominational church here in Baton Rouge. He looked around and saw this congregation that received him very well, and he thought, I can do this.
Scott loves the thrill and respect of preaching and decides to follow his newfound calling.
He got ordained online, and then he opened his own church.
Now, Scott Rogers, a man around town and local TV celebrity, is also Pastor Scott.
And first service, I'm told he had 50 to 60 people show up at his church.
He had the gift of gab, naturally, because to start a TV show and obviously start a church, you have to be able to speak to people.
He's also now becoming a religious leader.
It's at this point when Scott would bring in someone that will become an integral part of his professional and personal life.
Maria Edwards was co-pastor of the church with Scott, and she helped bring other people into the church and put together the sermons and the program that the congregation would see each week.
She and Scott had an extremely close relationship. She was in charge of financials for the church. Basically, she was in charge of everything.
Maria Edwards was frequently at Scott's home on weekends. They had big family meals. They got together for holidays together. She was very much part of the family.
But how well does Scott really know his new friend and business confidant?
There are just certain types of people that you're suspicious of.
A lot of people do have secrets. What you see is not always the way somebody really is.
Scott's facing a similar issue. His increased public presence is beginning to raise eyebrows.
I just thought, there's more to this guy. I thought that his persona as he presented it was just completely false. But a lot of people did not share that opinion.
Scott Rogers has built a powerful public life for himself and for his family. But disturbing questions and painful secrets will tear it all apart.
There's a deep, dark secret that is about to come to light.
Scott Rogers has built a good life in Baton Rouge. With his family, he runs a successful TV production company and a local church.
He's something of a celebrity. and he's very involved in the community.
Scott is also a foster parent and eventually decides he wants to expand his family even further.
He decided he wanted to adopt a second little boy. And he went on his TV show saying, I'm adopting a second child, and as soon as the adoption's final, I'll have him on the program so you can all meet him.
Scott fills out the boy's adoption papers, and it's not long before he welcomes him into the family.
He was recognized by the Department of Children and Family Services for fostering children in his home.
To the public, he was a good person. People looked up to him. He was highlighting the good in the community. He was bringing to light the nonprofits, giving to the charities. He's a perfect parent.
He presented himself in a way that was very positive and civic-minded, and over time, he had built up quite a network of people, both personally and professionally, who thought very highly of him.
Many of them are invited to appear on Scott's TV show to discuss important social issues.
Wherever there was a powerful politician or somebody who held a powerful office, he was right there.
He invited elected officials, from the governor to statewide elected officials to the mayors. I mean, anybody in any prominent role in the community that he could get on the show, he brought in. He just fawned all over them.
Which he did shamelessly. He showered people with praise and sat there and told them how wonderful they were and stroked their egos on this show. Then what he did with all of these networks he formed is that he created this aura of legitimacy and respectability.
Scott begins to utilize these new, powerful political connections for his own financial benefits.
He tried to really expand by getting contracts with politicians to do their political campaigns or whatnot, any video services that they needed.
Scott's plan works. He's approached to co-produce a series of public education videos for Homeland Security on how to prepare for natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina. The contract will be shared between Scott and a local company owned by Rana Gray.
Rana is a fairly well-known person in this community in political circles. She has a background in public relations and politics and campaign management.
My business partner and I had a small public relations firm in Baton Rouge. The director of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness asked me if we'd be comfortable working with him, and my business partner and I said sure. So we ended up working on this project with Scott Rogers' company.
But afterwards, their relationship becomes soured when Scott reveals a more unscrupulous side.
Our client discovered that he was taking the same content and reselling it to the State Emergency Operations Center. So this content was basically being paid for twice.
Even more brazen and personal, Scott keeps the final $15,000 payment owing to Rana's PR firm that he collected.
He was refusing to hand over our fees. He was keeping them.
He pretty much scooped it all from beneath her by getting all the money, then refusing to give her her part of the money.
It was just very upsetting.
And this is where it gets ugly and public.
It resulted in a lawsuit being filed over non-payment of monies.
He was so mad that he was able to get the local newspaper to write a story where he claimed that he was forced to work with me and just saying lies about us. I mean, to me, it was slander. I was so angry about this because your entire livelihood and profession depends on you maintaining a reputation.
To defend herself and her company's reputation, Rana fights back.
I wrote a letter to the editor to try to correct it and set the record straight.
It was really the only recourse she had.
The newspaper publishes Rana's rebuttal. But her letter calling out and naming Scott Rogers does little to tarnish his squeaky clean image.
He was important, and he had a lot of important friends.
Why would anybody question somebody who was a pastor in a church?
But he had a dark side that no one here knew.
The shiny veneer of Scott Rogers' public persona seemed to be chipping away for some, But for Scott, building pressure and secrets only intensifies his resolve.
I had no idea the lengths he was going to try to destroy our firm. He was calling people at night, urging them to not work with us.
This is not the Scott Rogers from television.
It was just another part of the psychology of Scott Rogers. It was just part of the craziness.
But little does Rana know, her letter will set off a chain of events that will expose startling secrets. One day, when Scott Rogers is away from home, a life-changing disruption to his illustrious life comes crashing down on him in a very personal and devastating way.
Scott Rogers had custody of 2 foster kids, and Child Services removed them from Scott's home.
The kids were taken away from him, and Scott was very distraught, and he felt like his world was crumbling.
What is going on, and what deception, lies and hidden truths are threatening to be revealed?
You think that this is a great person, but behind those closed doors is a very dark secret.
And it may only just be the beginning. Popular TV host and church leader Scott Rogers is devastated after his 2 foster children are removed from his home.
Child Services said he had improperly filled out his paperwork. That's what led to Child Services taking the kids.
You know, I'm sure there were many questions and many untruths told on his application to even get these kids. And so once all that is revealed, it is Child Services' main priority and obligation to remove those children for their safety.
It's a publicly humiliating and troubling situation for Scott Rogers.
He was very distraught.
Scott Rogers gets Maria Edwards, his lieutenant at the church, to do a conference call with some of the parishioners and tell them it's all a big misunderstanding, that this has to do with him checking the wrong box on a form with the federal government. And we're all horrified and very supportive of him at that time.
What Scott and his parishioners don't realise is that Rana Gray is the person responsible for the children being removed from his custody. And it all started with her letter in a Baton Rouge newspaper.
That letter to the editor changed life for everyone involved in this story.
When she wrote this letter to the editor that included Scott Rogers' name in it, and that started this whole chain of events.
A young man living in the UK who had been looking for Scott Rogers for 13 years found my letter to the editor online.
The mysterious young man sends Rana an email. He says he was a former student of Scott's art school in the UK.
I was so shocked at what the email said.
The real story why Scott Rogers emigrated from the UK to the United States.
I don't think anybody had a clue about his past.
There was deception and lies. He fed people a lot of BS.
Shocked by the troubling truth of Scott Rogers, Rana Gray spends the next 10 months putting together the puzzling pieces of his past.
She took it and ran with it, and for someone who had no investigative background, no law enforcement background, Rana Gray just did a tremendous job.
We had 5 or so federal agencies involved. We had 2 U.S. attorneys' offices, Homeland Security, ICE, there were immigration people involved, U.S. Postal Inspection agents.
But little does anyone know that the federal investigation into Scott Rogers will uncover something else startling about him. He didn't just lie on the children's adoption papers.
Apparently, he had lied on some immigration forms he had filled out when he come to the States.
It's a felony offense.
Federal agents felt they had enough to take this before a federal grand jury.
The screws tighten on Scott even further when Kimberly, Stuart and Matthew receive subpoenas to testify in his fraud case.
So this is just building more and more frustration for Scott Rogers. If it comes to light that the applications to get into the United States were fraudulent. Well, guess what happens? You're deported back to the UK.
He was scared to death. And that's when everything started going downhill for Scott.
He was worried that the government was coming to get him. It was basically driving him crazy. Scott believed that the government was watching him and monitoring him, and he believed that they could tap in and listen to any conversations through cell phones. So he wouldn't allow guests at the house to bring cell phones into the house. He had to turn them off and leave them on a little table in the entryway to the house.
Scott also fears that the security cameras inside his home may be compromised.
Scott believed that they could possibly tap in and view his cameras. They were all turned and pointed up to the ceiling where they couldn't catch any footage in the house.
Not knowing who to trust or what other secrets and lies could get exposed, Scott Rogers attempts to escape his troubles.
He was very emotional. He was mixing painkillers with alcohol.
And his downward spiral continues out of the house.
I remember thinking, I wonder where he gets his money. I can't imagine this show generates much income. There's got to be some other revenue stream coming in.
He was considered somewhat of a high roller at the casino in Baton Rouge, and he was seen there almost every night.
And he wasn't winning. He was losing.
So he had debt. And some people who develop a gambling problem, I'm told, keep thinking they're going to hit the big payday and it's going to be worth it.
Scott's family doesn't know what to do.
They're seeing him spiraling out of control. They're just thinking, oh my God, he's going through so much.
I can't imagine how upsetting it was for them.
In the days leading up to the grand jury convening to hear witnesses, Scott had arranged something of a family dinner at the house. Scott was struggling with everything that was going on, and he thought that he was feeling like the end was near.
Fortunately, Scott's friend and co-pastor is there to offer support.
I think he knew they were about to deport him or he was going to go to jail.
The stress affects the whole family. But the show must go on, and Stuart is happy to get away to do some work at the studio.
One evening, Stuart was at the studio in Baton Rouge.
Stuart ends up closing up. He goes to take the garbage out.
From what I understand, he walked out toward the dumpster.
Then Stuart is seen getting into a black vehicle.
And nobody had seen or heard from him since then.
Maybe he's been kidnapped.
He has disappeared.
Scott and his family are in turmoil, deeply troubled by the mysterious disappearance of Stuart, who may have secrets of his own.
Stuart was at the studio in Baton Rouge, and he went to take the trash out, and he got into a car and left from the studio area. His family were concerned about his well-being because they hadn't seen or heard from him in a couple of days.
There's this fear something is wrong.
So what happened to Stuart? Scott has secrets and a growing list of enemies. Is it possible one of them was behind Stuart's disappearance? And who were the two men in the car?
We don't know.
And so there was a lot of confusion, I think, among everyone of what was going on.
Luckily, Scott is able to obtain the surveillance footage of the outside trash area.
So this is actually all caught on video. Stuart goes to take the garbage out and walks to this black vehicle with two people.
It's scary.
They are possibly assuming he's been kidnapped or he's been picked up by officials to be questioned about Scott Rogers.
There was a level of paranoia, especially on Scott's part.
He went into a total panic about it. Stuart's missing. They took the children and now he's disappeared.
I can't imagine how that must have made that congregation feel.
They came together. They had his back.
With Scott in deep crisis, Matthew contacts WAFB-TV, the station that airs around town, and tells them the show is cancelled due to a family catastrophe. And Maria goes to Scott's home to support the family in their time of need.
Maria had been staying with Scott Rogers, doing her part to just whatever she can do to be there for a friend, for her co-pastor.
Maria was very concerned about the well-being of Scott.
He hadn't slept in 2 or 3 days.
Scott is not only despondent about the missing Stuart, the grand jury into his immigration status is looming.
The federal government was going to have him deported for the false information he put on his immigration paperwork.
I can imagine he was scared to death.
He was a man who was used to having control over everything, and now his control was starting to unravel and be lost.
His world was crumbling.
It's early in the morning before the grand jury hearing for Scott Rogers, and Scott and Matthew have been up all night. Around 5 a.m, Maria is awakened by voices downstairs.
Scott and Matt had stayed up all night and weren't sleeping.
They're roaming the house, agitated.
She has no idea what's going on.
She saw Scott and Matthew prepare a number of documents.
Scott Rogers looks at Maria with a soul-searching gaze and passes her some documents and envelopes, then brushes past her to bed.
He believed that he was going to be deported after the grand jury convened.
He started talking to her about how scared he was. I believe Scott even asked her to say prayers over him.
Scott and Matthew are exhausted and distraught as the long night turns to morning. Hours later, what everyone has been dreading has arrived. It's time to leave for the grand jury.
Scott's daughter, Kimmy, had been called before the federal grand jury. Matthew had been called, and Stuart had been called.
But with the family in serious turmoil, Matthew decides he's not going to testify.
Kimmy was leaving to go to the grand jury. He said, "I'm not going." He was staying there with Scott at the house.
There's that fear deep inside that everything is about to come to light.
Across town, with Stuart still unaccounted for and Matthew a no-show, Kimberly does her duty and prepares to testify.
Kimmy was at the federal courthouse in Baton Rouge to testify in front of the grand jury into the inquiry into Scott Rogers.
None of the proceedings, to my knowledge, actually got underway.
Back at the house, Maria Edwards nervously stands by the front door, looking out the window, fearing the immigration authorities will storm the property at any moment.
Maria was very distraught and was very concerned about Scott.
The world around Scott Rogers is in deadly crisis as shocking secrets blast to the surface. Just before 1 p.m. on the first day of Scott Rogers' grand jury hearing, the tranquility of this quiet family neighbourhood is shattered by 2 loud blasts.
911, what's the emergency?
The Iberville Parish Sheriff's Office receives a distressing 911 phone call from a woman at Scott's residence.
I just heard another noise. Oh my God!
He was very distraught and upset.
The caller identifies herself as Maria Edwards.
Ma'am? You gone. Do something. I just have to know if you can you please send somebody over very quickly, please. A gun? What happened?
She had heard some loud pops that she believed to be gunshots.
She was frantic.
Can you please send somebody over very quickly, please?
And she says, just get here. Just hurry up and get here right now.
Oh my God.
And so they dispatched Everville Parish Sheriff's Office to the scene.
When we arrived on the scene, we were met by Maria Edwards. Maria was very distraught.
Also on the scene are investigators Laurie Morgan and Ronnie Hebert.
We had to find out what was going on.
We made our way up the stairs. We proceeded to the door and opened the door to the bedroom.
Inside, they make a grisly discovery.
We saw Scott Rogers laying in the bed with a large amount of blood.
He had one single gunshot wound to the forehead.
It looked like he was just shot right where he laid.
Everybody was, like, oh my God, who would do that to Scott Rogers?
And as we got more into the room, we could see some feet on the other side of the bed.
The other victim is soon identified as Matthew, one of the residents of the house.
We observed a gun laying on the floor next to Matthew, as well as what appeared to be a gunshot wound to his head.
But Matthew still has vital signs.
They called EMS immediately, and he was airlifted to a nearby hospital.
If Matthew survived, eventually Matthew may open up and talk about what all happened.
Unfortunately, Matthew never makes it off life support and dies from the gunshot injury, leaving detectives to solve the mystery.
And then as the scene unfolds, as you're in there photographing and finding evidence, the first thing we assumed was that it was murder-suicide.
But nobody knew what had happened. It was too premature to make a call.
It was just a bizarre crime scene. It really was.
Local news outlets hear about Scott and Matthew's deaths and are now at the scene.
That was an instant story. This was a hot topic.
I was a reporter in Baton Rouge at that time. We're all working our sources. We're trying to find out a little more detail.
Word has also reached Scott's parishioners.
There was maybe 10 to 20 people out there on the street in front of the residence during the investigation, visibly upset and crying and shocked about what had happened.
While all of this is unfolding, authorities inform Kimberly of the tragedy.
She was in court in Baton Rouge at the time.
When they got word that there'd been a shooting at the house.
Kimberly is devastated. So the grand jury is adjourned just as new startling facts about her deceased father were about to be made public.
We learned that Scott Rogers had actually changed his name about 5 times over the course of his life.
His real name is actually Richard Scott Rogers.
And when filling out his immigration paperwork, Scott Rogers used variations of his name and did not disclose information about the previous case that he had been charged with while in the UK.
And what he was charged with shocks investigators.
Scott Rogers, as it turned out, was a child molester.
Scott Rogers had been accused of sexually abusing a young boy when he was running the Performing Arts Academy in Bury St. Edmunds. And he wasn't the only one who was sexually abused.
It turns out Ethan was one of them, and now as an adult, after hunting Scott for years, he shared his story with Rana.
He mentioned in the email that there'd been a court case involving one of the young boys abused by Scott. The tabloids were just going crazy with this story.
But during the trial, it was the boy's word against one of the most respected people in the community.
It's almost no surprise that the trial ended in a hung jury.
He was acquitted of them charges.
But the negative publicity generated by the trial severely damaged Scott's reputation. His wife soon divorced him, enrollment in his arts academy dropped, and so Richard Scott Rogers fled to the US to start a new life under his new name.
So in his head, nobody's gonna find him. He has escaped his deep, dark secret.
So he came here determined to not get caught again.
Investigators wonder, was Scott's shameful secret somehow related to his and Matthew's deaths?
Nobody knew what had happened. We had to find out what was going on, put that puzzle together, and then we'll make a determination as to what we think happened.
At the crime scene, they find some disturbing evidence. Several blood-stained notes.
It appeared that they were suicide notes written by Matthew.
And others containing instructions for Maria Edwards.
All kind of account and personal information.
There were also very explicit directions on how to sell off businesses and how to handle the finances.
It seemed like everything was being left with Maria in charge.
We found some wills that were written by Scott Rogers.
And they name Maria Edwards as the sole beneficiary.
It was shocking.
It appears she benefited greatly from the deaths of Scott and Matthew.
It was very concerning that she was in the house at the time it happened and that he had changed his wills, leaving everything to her. Scott had his security systems in the house, and it was very suspicious to us that the cameras were turned up to where they could not film any activities in the house.
The police want Maria to answer some serious questions, but she isn't cooperating.
And she didn't want to talk to them without a lawyer.
So why would you need an attorney?
Maria's behavior was very abnormal. So we felt that there might have been a little bit more going on there that she wasn't telling us.
Detectives wonder if Maria Edwards may have information about Scott Rogers and Matthew's mysterious deaths.
We learned that Miss Maria seemed like she was going to benefit from this.
He left all his fortune to her. He left everything to Maria, yet he left nothing for his own daughter, his own biological daughter.
So, to me, she was a suspect.
But at that time, we still had no evidence to link Maria into being involved in what happened upstairs.
She continued to say, I needed my attorney present. And finally, about 9 days after the shooting, she arranges to go in with her lawyer and do her interview.
It's Chris Alexander, who is apparently the attorney for Miss Maria Edwards. She was very nervous.
Maria did deny any knowledge of knowing that Scott had ever molested any children.
All I saw from him was doing good, doing good, doing good.
She got fooled by Scott Rogers. She got duped just like everybody else. Could you tell us what transpired that day?
She gave us a little bit of background on how Scott had been distraught about everything going on in his life.
He was desperate, he was crying.
Maria says after Kimmy left for court, Matthew and Scott went upstairs to Scott's bedroom.
I stayed downstairs, and I'm now waiting to hear from Kimmy about the court, what's happening in the jury. At the same time, I'm looking at all the cars because every noise, a truck or a car or something, well, they're gonna come and pick them up, they're gonna take them. And as I was doing that downstairs, I heard a shot, and I was freaked out. And I heard a second detonation.
Did Matthew or Scott tell you that I'm going to shoot myself, or Matthew's going to shoot me, or anything like that? Never discussed?
Never discussed, never in my wildest dreams.
We truly believe that she was downstairs when it happened.
But they need to be certain.
She going to submit to the DNA?
Yes, and I already told her about that.
Okay.
And I appreciate y'all doing it at the end of the interview.
Your DNA will be compared to the DNA on the weapon.
And the results clear Maria of any suspicion of wrongdoing.
Matthew was the only one that fired the gun. Maria was definitely downstairs at the time of the shooting.
It was a murder-suicide. His own son-in-law shot and killed him before he killed himself.
In the end, he was too cowardly to just take his own life.
Investigators soon learn that's the reason why Stuart disappeared.
Originally, Scott had talked to him about killing him and then killing himself.
Stuart wanted no part of that, and so he wanted to get out. So he arranged an escape, essentially.
He reached out to a federal agent, and then, from what I understand, 2 federal agents arrived the next day. They put him in their unit and took off with him to put him in protection.
Stuart agrees to be interviewed by Iberville Parish investigators, where he will eventually expose even more shocking secrets about Scott Rogers.
I've been through a lot of interviews, but that was probably one of the most interesting and heartbreaking interviews I've ever been a part of.
I met Scott Rogers when I was 12 years old. My parents met Scott with me, and Scott extended me a full scholarship at his performing arts school. By the time I was 13, he was engaging in sexual abuse with me as a kid. There were at least 3 other kids that I know of.
One of them was Matthew.
That, to me, is mind-blowing.
He basically manipulated Matthew and Stuart to live with him.
The truth is, if when I was like 17, you could have come down with an army and I wouldn't have left that man.
He basically brainwashed these kids into coming to the United States with him.
And Kimmy had actually married Matthew at Scott's request to help with the citizenship process.
It was a cover marriage to get him into the States legally.
But Scott's dark past would eventually catch up with him. And this time, he's unable to escape it.
He had built such a public persona of respectability, and he knew that was over, and that he was going to be exposed for what he really was, and I guess his ego just couldn't stand to go on like that.
So he chose to take the easy way out.
And unfortunately, Matthew's been brainwashed for 23 years, so he does. He shoots him first, and then he turns the gun on himself and shoots himself in the head.
I don't shed any tears over Scott Rogers' demise, and I don't think a lot of people do.
There's no telling how many victims Scott Rogers would have left in his wake had this not come to light.
And it all started with Rana Gray's letter.
I still get emotional recounting this whole saga. This little letter to the editor changed everything. I don't know that Scott Rogers would have ever been exposed for what he really was.
This makes me realize that a lot of people do have secrets and hide things, and you don't always know their true ways.
I was a police officer for 32 years, and I learned, as every police officer does, that there's evil in the world. What's hard to accept, though, is that they don't look like monsters. They don't wear a name tag or a shirt that says, I'm dangerous, I'm evil, I'm a child molester. The ones that are the most dangerous are the ones that you trust.
Good friend of the show is Colonel Michael Edmondson.
I don't ever want to meet another Scott Rogers. I don't ever want to investigate another crime like this.
And I pray that all of his victims, be it people in the UK or be it here, they have the strength to move forward.
Nestled in the affluent suburbs of Detroit, A web of dark secrets and hidden lives shock a community and rip a family apart with murder.
It's a sad story. It's a tragic story that involves so many different lies and secrets.
It was a shock to everybody. People were in tears in this community.
It looked like they had the perfect life, but there were a lot of secrets going on.
Lie after lie and secret after secret, the deceptions grow.
They got bigger and they got bigger. And when you have all those lies, eventually it falls apart.
Exposing incredible evil.
It was very disturbing.
The hair in the back of my neck stood up. Something's going on here, you know?
I've never seen a murder like this.
How did this happen and who was responsible?
Nobody could figure this out.
It tore up a lot of people's lives.
We need to find the person who did this.
And that's where the secret lies.
A secret to die for.
Grosse Pointe Park is a beautiful place. Beautiful homes, expensive homes. It's a close-knit community. The neighbors look out for each other. It's affluent.
If you have the money, this is where you want to live. Probably one of the top communities in Michigan and in the United States.
It's a great place to raise your family. Good schools, good city services, crime is low.
Grosse Pointe hadn't had a homicide in 3 decades.
Grosse Pointe Park residents Jane and Bob Bashara are living the American dream.
Bob and Jane lived in an upscale neighborhood down by the water. It was pretty idyllic.
They had a beautiful home, 2 wonderful children. They had just a beautiful persona of what a happy married couple should be.
Bob was very respected, and Jane was a real pillar in the community. She was loved by a lot of people.
It looked like they had the perfect life, like one of those Norman Rockwell paintings.
Bob had a very big image.
He portrayed himself as this big persona, this big personality around town.
Bob's father was a very prominent judge, and his grandfather was a magistrate. Very well-respected men. And I think Bob wanted to take after them. He liked people to admire him. He liked to be envied by people. He liked to be the center of attention.
He was the president of the local Rotary Club. He was the director of the local golf league.
And he was a member of the very exclusive country club there and golf club.
And that's what he was. He was bigger than life. He was Big Bob.
But things are not always as they seem.
Jane was a very driven woman. She was intelligent, very well liked by the community, by her family, her co-workers.
She was an excellent human being, and she was a person that all her friends came to for advice, for help.
Jane was a marketing representative. She worked hard her whole life.
She retired early. She had a ton of savings.
She did a lot of community work, tons of work for the church. She was married to this wonderful man.
Jane and Bob are in the prime of their lives with 2 grown children away at college.
They had 2 children, Bob Jr. and Jessica. Jessica and Jane were really tight, even more so than most mother and daughters.
She loved her children. Jane was a great mom.
You had this beautiful family that looked to be perfect from the outside, but if you took a peek on the inside, it wasn't exactly perfect.
Every perfect story has secrets, and secrets have a way of revealing themselves.
They had struggles in their marriage.
But I think both of them felt like they had an image that they had to uphold.
The Bashara's problems scratch their way out of the shadows when Bob's real estate business begins to flounder.
Bob managed quite a few rental properties, and they were going down the drain. They were not doing well at all.
The real estate market took a downturn during the recession. He's losing money hand over fist. That affected him more than it would your average Joe. With Bob, His persona of a rich guy was everything to him.
Bob had a very big ego.
He's the big real estate guy. He considered himself the toast of Grosse Pointe, and that's really all Bob had to cling to.
So he pretends nothing is wrong. But a failing business and financial instability affect every aspect of the Bashara's life.
When Jane found out, she was very upset.
He was so bad with his financial dealings that she was forced to go back to work.
After saving all these years and after retiring, she had to do it all over again. There was a lot of resentment there.
Jane also discovers that Bob has another secret.
Bob had a severe gambling problem. There was one incident in Las Vegas where Bob gambled $10,000 of Jane's savings, gambled it away. Jane was livid.
Looking for comfort and support, Jane tells her daughter Jessica about some of her problems.
Jane told her that they've been having some marital issues and they're trying to work things out.
And their problems will only get worse.
Jessica was home from college. And she discovered Bob surfing fetish websites. And it greatly upset her.
It was a horrible situation, a very embarrassing situation.
Bob Bashara's secret sexual interests have been discovered by his daughter.
She says, "What are you doing? What are you looking at?" He tells her, "Your mom can no longer satisfy me sexually, and I need to find other avenues."
Very shocking. To tell your daughter that, that's unforgivable.
Devastated, Jessica confides in her mother.
Jane must have been mortified.
If you're in Jane's shoes there, how do you deal with that? Jane was concerned about image as much as Bob was. She didn't want it well known that they were having marital problems.
So she was very determined to make their marriage work.
To help save their relationship and image in the community, Bob and Jane seek professional help.
They went to marriage counseling because they weren't getting along. Jane felt that Bob wasn't being honest and truthful with her.
In fact, Bob's mind may very well be somewhere else.
Bob was two-sided. He's going to participate in marriage counseling. He's going to improve himself. Things are going to work out. But it was all a lie.
Immersing himself in work and play, Bob spends more time at the golf course and visiting his properties like his apartment complex that holds the Hard Luck Lounge.
The Hard Luck Lounge is your typical dive bar in Detroit. Above it, there were a few apartments that Bob rented out. He could go in there and be Big Bob.
The guys who owned the bar were friends of mine, and I'd see him there once in a while.
He owned the building, so everybody sort of treated him with respect.
He was well known there.
And Bob likes the attention from the female patrons.
Bob used this property as his den of iniquity, let's call it.
As distance and turmoil builds in the marriage and lives of Jane and Bob Bashara, Jane reaches out to a dear friend.
Jane confided that Bob asked her to go to a key party.
A key party is when all the participants take their keys, throw them in a big bowl, and then everyone takes a set of keys, and whosever key you hold, you have sex with that person.
Jane said she didn't want any part of that. She wanted nothing to do with it. She told him, "Nah, you can go do whatever you want. Go do that. I'm not into it. Just don't embarrass the family."
But there are more secrets to be uncovered in this family.
They got bigger, and they got bigger, and they got bigger.
That will lead to murder.
When you have all those lies, eventually it falls apart.
There are secrets and turmoil in the private lives of Bob and Jane Bashara. But to the unexpecting community, life goes on as normal.
You had a couple who from the outside appeared everything's still great, you know, they attend all the right things. She ran the Mother's Club at the high school. They go to church, he's the church deacon, et cetera, et cetera.
I think Jane did like living a nice life in Grosse Pointe and everything that went along with that.
As Bob navigates his daily routine of managing his apartment buildings, he has business with Steve Tibado, owner of a local appliance shop.
Bob would come to my store and he'd say, I want 5 stoves and 5 refrigerators. One time he came in and asked me if I knew somebody that could take care of one of his apartment buildings.
Bob needs a handyman to do some work around his properties, and Steve knows just the man.
I always try to help people out. I gave Bob Joe's number. He's a real big guy, he's real strong. I says, maybe you take him on as a worker.
Bob hires Joe Gentz as a handyman and gives him an apartment in one of his buildings. It's a good arrangement for both men.
Joe called me and he thanked me for hooking him up with Bob. I said, no problem. You know, I hope it works for you guys.
With a handyman at his beck and call, Bob puts Joe to work.
After Bob hired Joe, he told him to go by his house and do some work in the yard. He met Jane briefly. They had a conversation.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. I thought it
Bob's beautiful wife.
That's very nice of you. Thank you.
Little does anyone know that the 6'4", 225-pound man has secrets of his own.
Joe Gentz had an explosive temper. He had a criminal history. He was married at one time, and we know that he was physically and verbally abusive to his ex-wife. He was fighting to keep custody of his daughter, and he was desperate for money.
But what's unknown to Bob's family, friends, and business associates is that his deceit also runs deep.
Bob was leading a double life.
With unusual interests.
He puts an ad on a kinky website. Master from Grosse Pointe looking for a slave.
And he finds a taker.
Rachel was divorced. She was a mother. She was basically bored with the way her life was going.
She wanted to put herself in a master's hands. He could then financially take care of her, make all the decisions. And Bob said he was that man.
But juggling 2 very different lives isn't easy.
Bob was smart in the sense that he knew how to balance his lies and his secrets.
As time went on, it became a pretty intense relationship. And I think Rachel was in love with him.
They were in this BDSM master-slave relationship where he controlled everything about her and took care of her.
For convenience, Bob moves Rachel closer.
He moved Rachel into one of the apartments above the Hard Luck Lounge. Like a bird in a cage, I think Bob wanted to keep Rachel.
But it turns out there are other nefarious reasons. There are strange things going on in the basement of the Hard Luck Lounge.
Neighbors would see people coming out of there dressed in all leather and whips and chains at all hours of the night.
Seen a lot of crazy stuff going on over there in the alley. I seen these people dressed up. I go, well, they must be having a masquerade party somewhere, but I didn't know it was in the basement.
As Bob's affair deepens, he makes plans to insert himself into Rachel's family life and spins another lie to Jane.
He had told Jane that he was going to Florida to meet up with an old friend to have a golf weekend, but it was all a lie. Bob went to South Carolina for Rachel's daughter's wedding.
Unbeknownst to Jane, Bob paid for the entire wedding with Jane's money.
Despite his charming facade, Bob isn't being honest or truthful to either Jane or Rachel.
He's keeping secrets from his mistress. He was keeping secrets from his family.
Yet Bob starts looking for more.
It wasn't good enough just to have Rachel serving him. He wanted the third to join their kinky relationship.
Bob went online to look for their third person for their relationship, and he found a possibility.
A woman named Janet who lived in Oregon. Rachel wasn't happy about him wanting to introduce another woman, but she went along with it because he was Master Bob. And what Master says, she has to do.
Eager to explore the possibilities with Janet in Oregon, Bob deceives Jane again.
Bob tells his wife he has to go to this symposium of teaching him how to sell cleaning products, and it'll maybe help him make some money.
Jane was happy about that because she figured that the household needed more income.
But in reality, that was a total lie.
He didn't think he's going to get caught, but he just kept going on and on and on. Here he is going to Oregon to see some girl to have some sexual encounter with.
but she was put off by Bob.
And it just didn't work out.
Bob returns home, his conquest to Oregon a failure. And things only get worse for him when Rachel does some online sleuthing.
Rachel found out he was still married. She saw pictures of him online with Jane at a bunch of parties.
So Bob spins more deception.
Bob, of course, lied again and told her it was all in the works. He's going to get divorced. He just needed time. And Rachel believed him.
Bob goes one step further and tells Rachel he wants to elevate his commitment to her and buy a house together.
And Rachel was ecstatic.
But there are problems.
Rachel believed that Bob was this wealthy man, but Bob could not afford to buy a home. He was broke.
But he still went through the whole charade of hiring a real estate agent, looking at houses, and they even decided on a home and set up a closing.
But Bob needs to get some money together, so he tells Rachel they have to delay the purchase of their house.
There was always a reason why it couldn't happen. It was just keep pushing it off, pushing it off.
Rachel didn't know what was going on. She was not happy.
Bob's delay tactics renew her fears about his commitment.
He kept telling Rachel he's going to get divorced, but that never came to fruition.
Frustrated, Rachel draws a battle line in the sand.
Rachel gave Bob an ultimatum. Either he divorces his wife or she's gone.
The two main women in Bob's life are reaching their breaking point, and Bob's deception is the fuel on the fire.
Jane started to suspect that he was having an affair.
And at the same time, Rachel put pressure on Bob to see those divorce papers, which of course never existed.
Bob was desperate at this point. He had a deadline of January 27 to close on the home that he was to purchase with Rachel.
Bob was in love with Rachel, and he didn't know what to do, so he panicked.
With his back against the wall, Bob does something dastardly.
In his mind, he had one solution: Jane's money.
She had a pretty significant 401k.
She had $800,000 in savings.
Bob went behind her back and took some money out of her account.
Bob steals from his wife to get a down payment for his mistress, but it doesn't take long until Jane discovers her money is missing.
Jane was so mad. She was angry.
Jane knows who to blame.
By this point in time, she didn't trust Bob. She knew he lies and that he would do things behind her back without her knowledge or permission.
And it only gets worse.
Bob was seen out at a local restaurant with Rachel, and that person sent an anonymous letter to Jane that Bob was having an affair.
The secret that Bob kept hidden from his wife has been finally brought into light, fully exposed for Jane to reevaluate virtually everything she thought she knew. Bob's lavish spending, his peculiar interests in violent sexual imagery, his so-called business trips.
She was angry at her husband.
And herself. Jane vows to confront Bob face to face with what she discovered.
She was considering a divorce.
Jane organises with Bob to have dinner the following evening.
He didn't know that Jane was going to divorce him. He had no idea.
In fact, no one could have predicted what was about to happen.
The next morning, Jane got dressed and went off to work. Bob went off to go take care of his rental properties. Toward the end of the afternoon, Jane and Bob had a phone conversation, and she reminded him to be home that night.
Until then, Bob stops by the Hard Luck Lounge.
He went there and hung out. He had a few drinks.
Around 8 p.m, Bob leaves to meet Jane for dinner.
Bob came home and he looked around and Jane wasn't there, but her briefcase was on the table. And he just figured, you know, she's probably out doing something. He didn't worry about it.
But after several hours, there's still no sign of Jane. Bob calls Jessica to see if she's heard from her mother.
He goes, hey, Mom ain't home. Have you heard from Mom? No, Dad, I haven't heard from Mom.
And Jessica said she's probably out with friends.
But when Bob contacts them, they tell him they haven't heard from Jane either.
It made no sense whatsoever. Something was wrong.
At 11 p.m, Bob Bashara calls 911.
Grosse Pointe Park, Police and Fire.
My name is Bob Bashara. My wife is not around, and she's not answering her cell phone, and the car and her purse and her are gone, and I'm just a little concerned.
Since Jane has not been missing for more than 24 hours, police are unable to do anything. They tell him to call back tomorrow if Jane doesn't turn up.
Bob was panicking.
He tells Jessica he thinks something horrible may have happened to her mother, and they would soon learn the answer.
The next morning, a tow truck driver was out on the east side of Detroit doing their normal rounds, looking for abandoned cars to tow. And he came across a high-end car in an alley in a desolate part of town.
And to everyone's shock, the car isn't empty.
There's a white female body in the back seat.
The morning after Jane Bashara is reported missing, a Detroit tow truck driver makes a grisly discovery.
At first, the tow truck driver believed it was just a stolen car, so he's just going to tow it to his yard. He goes towards the rear of the car and sees a body inside.
The tow truck driver notified the Grosse Pointe police. They ran the license plate and it came back to Jane.
Grosse Pointe Park police detective Michael Narduzzi is one of the first law enforcement officers at the scene.
We looked inside the car and saw Jane's body. She was deceased. She was laying on the bench in the back seat with her knees and her feet on the floor. She had heavy trauma to the left side of her jawline and neck. It was deep, dark purple from her ear all the way down to the middle of her neck. We knew we had a homicide at that point.
Narduzzi is assigned lead detective on the case.
There was a ton of pressure.
Grosse Pointe Park police, they haven't had a homicide in 3 decades.
I felt determination that we're going to bring whoever did this to justice.
Narduzzi and his team of investigators examine the crime scene for potential clues.
There were so many elements of this that stood out initially. What was she doing on the east side of Detroit?
It's a bad area of Detroit. She had no reason to be there. Somebody brought her there.
Detectives consider the possibility that Jane Bashara may have been carjacked, driven to the location, then robbed and murdered.
But it appeared that nothing was taken. Her cell phone was there, her wallet, credit cards, her ID was there on the floor of the passenger side.
This evidence suggests there must be another motive behind Jane Bashara's murder. But what?
This isn't your normal murder case. There's more to this.
Grosse Pointe Park police drive to the Bashara residence to inform Jane's family of her murder.
Over the years, I've had to make a few death notifications, and it's not pleasant at all. It's one of the worst parts of the job.
They were devastated, especially the daughter. They want to know what happened.
To determine that, detectives ask Bob if he's willing to come down to the station to answer some questions.
Usually, the spouse is the first person you want to either clear or not clear, and then move on with your investigation.
Investigators ask the grief-stricken husband if there was anything unusual about the day his wife disappeared.
Bob told law enforcement that his wife was at work that day.
Toward the end of the afternoon, Jane and Bob had a phone conversation, and she reminded him to be home that night because they were supposed to go over their taxes together.
She called me and said that she was on her way home and that she'd be home around 5:15, 5:30.
And then he said, I went home later and she wasn't home.
I'm looking, I don't find her, so well, I'll check the garage, or her car's not there. And once I determine she's not home, I call her. And no answer, nothing.
Detectives ask Bob if he knew of any potential reason why his wife may have gone to the area of Detroit she was eventually found in.
What was she doing there?
It's a pretty bad neighborhood.
Bob reveals to detectives that he recently discovered his wife was hiding something from him.
I'm not going to narc on my poor wife, but she did smoke marijuana.
He said, I don't know where she would get it. Maybe she got it in that area.
That's one angle that we definitely have to look into and work it thoroughly.
They have racked my brain.
Bob also offers another potential theory of what may have happened to his wife.
At the time, there was a series of murders.
The local press dubbed them the Backpage Murders after 4 Detroit women were found slain in their vehicles after they answered dating ads on an adult website. Is it possible that Jane was also murdered during one of these clandestine sexual hookups?
But the profile of this incident did not meet the MO of the Backpage murders that were going on.
And Jane's family claims she would never have considered cheating on Bob.
Is there anything else that comes to mind?
No.
With little else to go on, detectives are stumped. Why would anyone want to murder Jane Bashara?
There was not a negative thing ever said about her by anyone. She was by all accounts, just an excellent human being.
A testament to that is the public's reaction to the news she's been murdered.
I was crying like a little baby. I mean, Jane was a wonderful, fine person.
She'd walk into a room and light it up, and somebody's taken that life away.
The news of her death just hit like a bomb. I mean, she was so well loved.
A public candlelight vigil is organised in honour of Jane, drawing hundreds of Detroit residents.
So much emotion here tonight, so many tears.
Everyone at this candlelight vigil just talked about what a great woman she was, and the whole community was in mourning.
There's no words. There's no words. A wonderful, loving person to all of us.
It's a senseless crime.
And front and centre is the grieving husband.
He held a press conference outside his house.
This is an inconceivable tragedy.
He goes on Good Morning America with his daughter. He goes on the national news. The public can't get enough of it.
It's just unthinkable that this happened to her and what she had to suffer. I am just so upset about it.
It's the lead story for the next 3 days.
With heightened media attention, images of Bob are broadcast to a wide audience. And that's when the phones light up.
Tips started pouring in, and I mean pouring in.
What surprises police is the anonymous callers don't reveal the identity of Jane's killer, but instead detail stunning secrets about the tearful widower himself, Bob Bashara.
People recognized him.
He's Master Bob. That was his alter ego.
He's in the BDSM lifestyle.
And that's not all.
We learned that he had a BDSM dungeon in the basement of the Hard Luck Lounge,
where they practiced different sexual acts. Nobody knew about this dungeon, especially his wife.
Suddenly, the mild-mannered father and upstanding community member has his facade ripped down and his hidden life is exposed to the entire world.
People were just absolutely shocked that this guy had this secret life.
And there are even more deceptions, lies, and secrets waiting to be uncovered.
Rachel wanted to live with this man in a beautiful house, happily ever after. It wouldn't happen unless Jane was gone.
As the mysterious details around Jane Bashara's tragic murder continue to dominate the news,
what happened to Jane Bashara and who may have killed her?
Abandoned in an alley.
Police say she died of strangulation.
new reports of Bob's secret sexual activities make headlines.
Bob Bashara's alleged secret life.
And Bashara's interest and involvement in the S&M bondage community.
There was a lot of interest in this story, like almost nothing I've ever seen. People were like, wow, this isn't the guy we thought he was. Bob's into some freaky stuff.
This is Master Bob. He goes to BDSM parties on the weekends.
And he's got a sex dungeon in the basement of the Hard Luck Lounge.
The shocking revelation leaves investigators wondering, does Bob Bashara's secret have any connection to his wife's murder?
But I don't think a lot of people believe that Bob could have been involved.
Bob was just this personable, wonderful, caring, giving philanthropist. It was incomprehensible that he could do that.
As detectives work through the new information of their own local fetish master, they discover one of Bob's other secrets, and she is living and breathing.
Bob was dating a girl named Rachel.
His dungeon's most loyal patron. Does Bob's secret mistress know anything about Jane's murder?
We found out exactly who Rachel was, and we got a hold of her within a few days.
Rachel agrees to be interviewed about her relationship with Bob.
She said she was looking for a daddy. She wanted someone who was going to financially, emotionally, and everything else take care of her.
Rachel also tells detectives something intriguing. She and Bob were planning on purchasing a house together in Grosse Pointe, but Rachel wanted proof that Bob was divorced from his wife.
And he couldn't produce those papers. He would always put her off.
Rachel reveals she gave Bob an ultimatum: divorce his wife by the home's closing date, or they were through.
The closing date was January 27, 3 days after Jane's murder.
The timing may raise suspicions about Rachel.
She wanted to live with this man in a beautiful house, happily ever after. It wouldn't happen unless Jane was gone.
But after speaking with her, detectives don't believe Rachel had it in her to kill anyone.
She was a good person. She just didn't know any better. He had lied to her, and she bought into it because she had no reason to believe different.
They believe Bob Bashara had a more convincing motive to murder his wife.
His whole world is crumbling on him. He had a line that Rachel drew in the sand that he had to be divorced by this date.
In Bob's mind, if Jane was gone, he would have the money available to buy the home and live his fantasy life with Rachel.
Detectives start working on the angle that Bob probably did it, because the husband is usually the #1 suspect in murders like this.
It's not long before police uncover compelling evidence against him. Several female patrons of Bob's secret sex dungeon claim the respected real estate mogul often displayed disturbing behavior.
Even within that subgroup, he was kind of considered kind of scummy because he would just start whipping them like as hard as he could without their permission. You don't do that, and he did that all the time.
There would be more tales of Bob's frightening sexual conduct when detectives receive a call from Janet, the woman Bob visited a few months earlier in Oregon.
According to Janet, she met with him, and he all of a sudden came up behind her and choked her until she passed out.
He beat the living daylights out of her. She was mortified. She was scared to death. She couldn't walk for 3 months afterwards.
Detectives have heard enough about Bob's violent and sadistic behavior. They bring him in for more questioning.
Bob told law enforcement that he had nothing to do with his wife's murder.
The Hard Luck Lounge, I think I went in there about 5:15, had a drink.
He points to his alibi as proof. He was at his favorite drinking spot.
He said he spent a lot of time at the Hard Luck that day.
Despite his alibi, detectives suspect he may still have something to do with Jane's murder.
All right, Mr. Bashara, I'll be talking to you tomorrow. Yes.
Fortunately, they have a way to see if Bob's hiding something. A lie detector test.
It's a great tool for us to use. If he passes it, law enforcement's going to clear him.
Detectives are intrigued by the results.
He passes a couple questions, but most of the questions he doesn't pass.
It's enough for police to obtain a search warrant on his house. The heightened police presence around the home draws the attention of local news stations.
The media was in a frenzy.
As seen in these news clips from that day.
They took computers out of the house, they took other items out of the house, searching for hours, taking countless pictures inside and using dogs to search for any evidence.
Nobody knew what was going on.
They soon learn that Bob Bashara is under investigation for his wife's murder.
With her husband being called a person of interest, no one wants to believe it.
There were a lot of people in the community that just could not believe that Bob Bashara did this.
And they may be right.
They go through looking for evidence in the house. They don't find any blood, nothing's messed up. They don't find anything. So what does Bob do? Goes on TV. I love my wife. I have 2 children. I'm a good person. This wasn't me.
But in a remarkable turn of events, the grieving husband, Bob Bashara, would end up offering another potential suspect to police.
I get a letter from the chief that was delivered by Bob's lawyer, naming Joe Gentz as a suspect, saying this guy has been harassing my client, Bob, demanding money for work he's done, and you should take a look at him.
Is it possible that handyman Joe Gentz was responsible for Jane's murder?
We learned he had a propensity for an explosive temper, for violent outbreaks at times.
We contacted him and he agreed to meet with us.
And Joe reveals something shocking.
I did it.
One week after Jane Bashara's lifeless body was found in her car, Grosse Pointe police have finally found her killer. Joe Gentz, the handyman Bob had hired.
Nobody knew anything about Joe Gentz at the time. He went into the Grosse Pointe Police Department and said, I killed that lady. I don't think they believed him.
We need to kind of know how you did it.
Detective Michael Narduzzi interrogates the 6'4" suspect to see if he's telling the truth.
It's very important, Joe, because the way you tell us you did it has got to match up with the forensic evidence on her. If it doesn't, then there might be some issues.
He laid out exactly what he did and how it went down.
But he reveals something shocking.
Bob told me to take her out.
He told us Bob coerced him into doing it, and that Bob was bugging him for months about killing his wife, Jane.
What did he say?
He said, want my wife dead.
He was going to give him a Cadillac and money. First was $5,000, then it was $8,000 to kill Jane. During this time frame, Joe had a court case to get custody of his daughter, and he was desperate for money.
I said, okay.
And Bob said it had to be done immediately.
He had a deadline. Okay. I don't know what that deadline is. Or why, okay.
Detectives believe they do. The closing date on Bob and Rachel's house.
The closing was set for, I believe, January 27th. And the week prior to that, Rachel said, I'm not moving in until I see these divorce papers.
Joe finally agreed to carry out Bob's diabolical plan on the evening of January the 24th, 3 days before the closing of the house.
Bob met me there, okay? He let me in the garage.
Jane came home from work, and she went in the garage.
And finds Joe there, moving boxes.
Joe says Bob then pulled a gun out and said, do it now.
What am I doing now?
According to Joe, if he didn't kill Jane, Bob was going to shoot him.
I hit her down on the ground.
Where did you hit her?
Back of the neck.
Joe then grabs Jane and he chokes her.
She tries to fight back.
Did she hit you? Did she pull your hair? She grabbed me. She scratched me.
He's got 2 distinct marks on his back.
She got you there? She got me about the neck. Okay.
And then he put his boot on her neck and crushed her neck. He said he heard it snap. I mean, just brutal, 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 brutal.
They both pick her up and put her body in the back of her SUV. And then Bob tells Joe to take her purse and sort of empty its contents out on the front seat to make it look like a robbery. And then Joe drives the SUV to a terrible part of town in the east side of Detroit.
And he got out and walked away.
After Joe disposed of Jane's body, Bob Bashara went back to the Hard Luck Lounge.
He was trying to build an alibi that he was over there the whole time. It all started to make sense.
They know Bob had a good motive for killing his wife.
He wanted the money that she had so he could start his new life with Rachel.
But detectives know it's just Joe's word against his.
Bob vehemently denied having anything to do with Jane's death. He denied hiring Joe Gentz to murder her. He denied being there. And he said Mr. Gentz did it all on his own.
Joe Gentz is charged with the murder of Jane Bashara and placed in the county jail to await trial. But questions about Bob Bashara's involvement still remain. That is until one of Bob's business associates contacts police with information about Bob.
Bob called me and said he's going to have all sorts of problems with Joe. As he said, if that guy testifies, it could be his life.
Bob asked him if he knew anybody that could kill Joe while he was inside the county jail.
Fearful for his own life, Steve tells him he knows someone in jail that can do the deed, and the pair agree to meet up at a later date to discuss the details.
I mean, here somebody goes talking about murdering somebody. I thought Bob was going to kill me.
The next call that Steve makes is to the Grosse Pointe Park Police Station.
I'm the guy that introduced Bob to Joe, and I felt bad about putting those two people together.
They tell Steve, all right, we're gonna put a wire on you, and we want you to meet with him, and we want you to discuss what he discussed over the phone.
I met Bob at my store. I felt obligated to Jane and her family, you know, to try to get justice for her.
Doesn't know is that law enforcement officers are watching and recording everything he says.
How much you talking? 20. Cash. No check. Yeah. Correct. Just yes or no. You think you can do that? Yes.
And he gave me $2,000. He says, take care of it.
Once Bob was caught giving the money to Steve to put the hit out on Joe, there was probable cause to arrest him for solicitation for murder.
With Bob Bashara behind bars, Detroit prosecutors begin to build the case against him for the murder of his wife. And when he's finally brought to trial, the evidence against him is insurmountable.
Next thing I know, he pulls a gun on me.
Joe was there, along with 30, 40 other witnesses.
Bob was convicted and sentenced to life in prison.
In August 2020, Bob Bashara died in prison while serving out his life sentence for the murder of his wife. Joe Gentz remains in jail, and although he is a convicted killer, some consider him a victim too.
I feel bad for Joe because he was used and duped. He ended up taking a plea deal and getting 18 to 28 years in prison for being coerced and cajoled and threatened by Bob.
There are so many victims of Bob's secrets and his lies. His wife, his children. Rachel, she was a victim as well.
But to those closest to Jane, the devastating loss will be felt forever.
The heartbreak is just incredible for the whole family.
It's a sad story. It's a tragic story. I get choked up even thinking about it.
I wish it would have never happened, you know? If I could turn back the hands of time, well, I'd turn them back. And everybody'd still be alive today.
Jane was a loving and devoted mother. She was a great wife. She was a great daughter, friend, relative, co-worker. She was admired by so many different people. She is sadly missed.